So, thank you so much for giving up your warm spring/summer evening to come over here to the station, to this Bristol Cable event. It's a great privilege and an honour to be joined by Gary Younge. I don't think he needs much in the way of introduction. This room's packed out. But he's an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, author, editor-at-large for The Guardian. And I think it's fair to say that he's become one of the most authoritative columnists digging beneath the surface of some of the key issues of our time. He's reported on a range of issues, from US politics to the far right, knife and gun crime, Brexit to gay marriage. And at the Cable, one of the things that interests us is not just reporting on events, but trying to understand why and how they happen and bringing them to life. And I think that's something that Gary Younge has really demonstrated through his journalism, particularly through the use of kind of personal accounts that rarely see the light of day, making stories that perhaps seem old or repetitive, new and compelling and essential for people to debate and to read. This talk is going to be kind of focused on the power of narratives in terms of shaping public opinion, and kind of looking at the crucial components of a good story. One of the things, again, that we've reflected on at the Cable is that traditional reporting so often focuses on the exception, the extraordinary, rather than the normal, looking at the freak event. And what that really means in many ways is that systemic violence and inequality, whether it's immigration policies or the closure of youth services, stabbings, fire standards in residential accommodations, are for the most part ignored, not reported on, deemed unnewsworthy, and that seriously let down a lot of people time and time again, and that really does need to be addressed. And Gary, I guess I'm flattering you over here, but I think it's accurate. But I do think that you make the journalism of the everyday a compelling read, and I'm really interested to hear about that today. And it's something that we aspire to at the Cable, to try and revive that on a local level, on a city level, because we believe that Bristol has been missing that. Apart from a few strong voices here and there, for the most part, the city has been let down in the way of public interest journalism. So this event is part of our media lab. So as well as being a journalism outfit in the traditional sense, we have a quarterly print edition and we publish daily online. We also run educational programs, and one of the key things that we believe is essential for the city is to be able to broaden out the pool of people who contribute and the people who write, the people who film. So this is part of a 5-month program. This is the largest event within that program. For the most part, it's hands-on workshops where 13 people are being trained in the basics of feature writing, investigative skills, and off the back of that series, they will be contributing content for the Cable and taking it forward within their own walks of life. Before I forget, fire safety. If there's a fire alarm, it's not a drill, use the back exit over there, and if you feel so inclined, I've been advised that you must go to outside H&M in Broadmead. I don't know if that's a sales pitch that CYN have wrangled with them, but no, please do that. Or use the main entrance that you came in through. So it's not often that we have close to 200 people, over 200 people in a room. So I thought I'd use this shamelessly to kind of promote the Bristol Cable's membership. For those of you who aren't members, I think about 70% of the people in this room are members. But I'll show you a sneak preview of our latest video, which hasn't really been shown anywhere else. And then we'll move over to Gary's talk. And that will be for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A and a chance for a broader discussion, which will hopefully involve many more voices here tonight.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Bristol Cable for inviting me. It is an honour for me. And when I was told, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I was originally told what the mission was. I said, look, if I could, I would, but I'm in Chicago, so I can't. But when, if I'm back, then feel free to get hold of me. And then, lo and behold, I was taken up on my offer, and here I am. I want to talk about the power of stories, because I think stories can change your life, and I think that stories can change the world. And I'm really not exaggerating when I say that. I think that the power of stories cannot be underestimated, that people will die for a good story, literally die for a good story or a bad story. People go to war for stories about their country or their culture or their religion, for what they think is right or wrong, for their own story about justice. People will fall in love with a story, either a story about themselves or about someone else. Stories can inspire and frighten. And I want to start out by talking about what I would refer to as meta stories, the bigger stories that kind of cover all of us and that we all grapple with in a range of ways. When I'm asked routinely after every mass shooting in America, so do you think they'll do gun control now? I generally respond by referring to the American story and the place of the gun in the American story, that when you go to the NRA convention, a National Rifle Association convention, and you ask, as I do, so explain this to me, I'm British, I don't understand, explain it to me. To a person, they will nearly always say the same thing. Are you married? Yes. Do you have children? Yes. And then they're off to the races. Imagine somebody broke into your house, they were going to rape your wife, they were going to kill your children, they were going to steal everything you worked for. What would you do? Would you swing a bat at them? Would you call the police and wait for them to pick up your body, or will you stand and fight? And if you're going to stand and fight, what are you going to stand and fight with? Now, the facts suggest something very, very different. The facts suggest that you're more likely to be shot if you have a gun in your house. Most people who are killed by guns shoot themselves. After that, most people who are killed by guns are actually killed by someone they know. What they should say is, are you married? Yes. Well, watch out for your wife, because she will probably be the one that shoots you. Or more usually, watch out for your husband, because he really will be the one that shoots you, given the toll of domestic violence in a country with guns. And that American story, those American stories, speak to rugged individualism, small government, masculinity, homestead, do for self, a range of things that are central to how Americans understand themselves, the stories that they've told themselves about who they are, and that those stories are more powerful than the facts, actually. And so long after the pictures of the grieving children or revelers or university students who've been massacred, and their offspring and their loved ones and their colleagues, long after those pictures have left your news feed, however you see them, these stories endure. Stories can be so powerful that you can believe a story against your own reality. When reporting my most recent book about all the kids who were shot dead in one day in America, I came across a statistic that African American men, black men, were more likely than any other men to feed their children, to read to them, to do their homework with them, to read them stories at night, and so on. And I thought, well, this cannot be. This cannot be, because I know from somewhere that African American men, black men, have a history of being flaky, of being absent. Obama has said so. Everybody knows this. And so I scout around looking for alternative facts for another story, a different story that I'm prepared to believe. And then I have to stop myself at some point and say, but hang on, you're a black father and you do these things. And yet somehow you are believing a story against your own reality, that there's somewhere out there. How do you know this? And so that once again speaks to the power of stories, that we are in the middle, I think, of an immense battle of stories with this tale of Windrush. That Britain has a series of competing stories about itself, and one is that it hates immigrants. And the other one is that it's an incredibly tolerant society that believes in fair play. One is that it's a white country to which black people have just arrived, and the other is that it's a multicultural country. And these stories have collided because there's a policy against immigration and against immigrants, and then there's a reality of immigrants and immigration. And so for the last week, we've been telling ourselves a story. All of us, even the Daily Mail, have been telling ourselves a story about immigrants who contribute and pay taxes and have families and build communities and grow relationships and add, not take away, add. And that somehow this story has been absent from much of our political life. And then stories can both distort and exclude and include, I guess. Distort and clarify. One of the more intriguing stories, and one of the stories that I'm proudest of, is finding Claudette Colvin. It's a story I did in 2000. Claudette Colvin was a young woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who in 1955 was kicked off the bus and who refused, who pled not guilty. And the civil rights movement were going to run with her, but Claudette was from a working class family. She was very dark, and then she got pregnant. And so they dropped her. And I found Claudette and I saw all the letters from around the country. She was going to be the one. When the leaflets went out after Rosa Parks was kicked off the bus, they said another woman has been kicked off the bus. That the suit against Montgomery bus department was Colvin versus the bus department because she was the first, just the first in the alphabet. And so America told itself a story which has been faithfully transmitted around the world, that the civil rights movement was started by an elderly lady, a nice old lady, who finished her work and was very tired and didn't want to stand up. And so she sat down and she changed the course of history. And I was at the funeral for Rosa Parks, and the various services both in Montgomery and Washington. And again they told this story of the individual, the hapless individual caught in the crosshairs of history who changes the country. What they said less of was that Rosa Parks was a full-time activist. I mean full-time, she was a seamstress too, but she was a lifelong activist who veered more towards Malcolm X than Martin Luther King, never quite got to nonviolence as a strategy, who had been kicked off that bus by that driver several times, but it never escalated to that scale. And that the stories often miss out the fact that then for the next 13 months, there was a massive collective boycott of the bus service, that this was a large number of people who did this. This was collective action. It wasn't one woman who, perhaps if she had better shoes, would have been okay standing up. Perhaps if she'd had an easier day, it would have been okay standing up. And so the story America tells itself is that individuals, atomized, isolated, they are the ones that change the world, not groups of people, not nameless groups of people whose names we might not know, but who carry us on their shoulders. And then they're not lesser stories, but they are not meta stories. And there is a phrase that you learn in journalism school, or, it's quite a common phrase that, look, when dog bites man, and it's always gendered that way, when dog bites man, that's not a story. When man bites dog, that's a story. And I understand that. What they're saying is that, look, that there are things you expect to happen, and then there are things that are exceptional. But the problem with that adage, or the thing that must be added to that adage, I think, is sometimes the question, well, who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep being bitten? And what can we do to keep these dogs under control? That quite often, the story is the thing that keeps on happening, the thing we have become inured to, the thing that is normal. That in America, when covering the gun crime book, the gun deaths book, it transpired that there were places where black kids were not supposed to die. Cinemas, malls, schools, universities. But then there were places where if they died, it didn't actually transform your understanding of how a city or a place worked. It confirmed it, that if they died in South Dallas or in that area of Newark, well, that's where young black people die. And so it's not really a story. And so when I would call the journalists who had written the story and say, do you have any leads that you would be prepared to share? Is there anyone I might talk to? They'd say, well, I didn't really follow it up because it's not much of a story if it happens down there. This is the story of Black Lives Matter in America. The problem is not that more black people are being killed. It's actually around the same rate, black people who are being shot by the police. It's that we have now decided to pay attention. And so what was banal and commonplace and everyday has become obscene and outrageous because we've decided that we will not support that story anymore. That's more or less what happened with Windrush. That these stories were broken. They started breaking them about 5 months ago. There's no new information out there. What has changed is, and the mistake that the government made wasn't that they were pursuing these people. That was entirely consistent with their hostile environment policy, where anybody who is a migrant is guilty of being illegal unless they can prove that they're not. That's the policy. It's not a glitch in the system, that's the system. The mistake that they made was underestimating the moral force of the Windrush generation and getting caught. That was the mistake. And so, in all sorts of ways, there are powerful stories around us really waiting, begging to be told. And in that, there are stories of people who we don't hear from, of individuals who, I don't like the term voice of the voiceless, because it's not that they don't have a voice, it's that nobody's listening. but that who aren't spoken to amazingly. It's not like people were trying to beat down Claudette Colvin's door, that most of the kids in the book that I wrote about all of the kids who were shot dead in America in one day, nobody had come to see them. No journalist had come to see them. Their stories weren't worth being told, and yet people assume that they know the story. And I get this quite a lot because of the kind of stories that I tell, that quite often an editor, either at The Guardian or well, let's leave them out of it because they pay my wages, but an editor, wherever they may be, a book editor, if particularly when the gun book was being shopped around, and they will say, I think we know this. And I will always say, well, how do you know? How do you know, and what do you know? One of the stories in the book is about a boy called Samuel Brightman, who's 16 and who's shot dead in South Dallas. And the story about him is 80 words long, 80, 90 words long, and that's it. And below that story, a woman called Marge Vargas has a comment saying, well, I know where my kids are. And you have to ask if adults can't do better. What's a 16-year-old boy doing out at 11:30 at night, as though there is a time when it's okay to shoot a child, as though 11 o'clock is the curfew point after which children may be shot. And then you find Samuel's mother and you find out what they were doing. And that night, Samuel's friend from school had come over to take his granny to church the next day because the day I had chosen was a Saturday, so the next day was a Sunday. And Samuel didn't know anyone in the area, sweet, kind of fragile kid, really. And so Denzel had come over to Samuel's place, and they had drunk cocoa, played Uno, and watched We're the Millers. That the worst thing Samuel had done that night was cheat at Uno. And then he decided that he would, as a good friend might, walk Denzel half of the way home, because Denzel was staying at his granny's, and his granny's was about 8 minutes away. And in that short walk, Samuel was shot dead, and nobody knows why. His mum knew where he was, but she just couldn't save him. But according to Marge Vargas, she knew that story already. It's very similar with many of the stories that I covered during the year that we did knife crime in Britain last year. And I caught up with the mother of a boy who was convicted of killing. And she showed me the letters that she had written to the local council saying, help me save my son. The conversation that she had with the social services saying either he's going to end up dead or someone's going to end up in a body bag. The parenting courses that she went on. And the little sign-off at the bottom from the council that said, we have to make £54 million worth of cuts this year. Join us in our discussion about how we streamline our services. That there's a story for people who are interested about cuts in youth services and child and adolescent mental health services, where children who have anorexia can't be seen unless they are skinny enough. And children at risk of suicide won't be seen until they have actually tried to commit suicide. And that if you cut the youth clubs and you cut the child and adolescent mental health services and you take away the EMMAs that help to fund kids staying in school, and you have a school system that prizes a certain kind of results rather than a certain kind of outcome for a human being, then guess what? Chances are that there is going to be a social consequence to that we are actively underfunding our youth, and yet the story of knife crime becomes instead a story of rap and grime and culture and crime, not of young people who have been abandoned by us, their elders. The other thing that was very interesting during that year, last year of knife crime, was realizing that there were no facts. That when we started the year, I just thought, well, let's just see how many kids died last year. I thought it would be a phone call, and it took us 11 months of lobbying and freedom of information requests and of persistence. And then finally, there were no statistics publicly available for the number of kids being killed by knives, which, given the amount of ink spilt and speeches made in Parliament, really makes you wonder what they were talking about, because they didn't know anything. And then what we found was very interesting, because in 2007, Tony Blair went to Cardiff, and he said, let's not pretend that it's not young black kids doing this. And what we found actually was that, first of all, most of these deaths are same race deaths, so you can deduce from who's dying, who's killing. That 2/3 of the children killed by knives in Britain are not black. That half of the deaths in Britain are in London, and the other half are outside. And the overwhelming majority of those in London are black, but the overwhelming majority of those outside London, and I'm talking 85 to 90%, are not black. And so we'd been having this conversation about black kids in London, which was entirely skewed and distorted. And so I think there is power in correcting stories, in presenting other stories, in showing that the child who killed is a child who killed and not a killer, that he's not defined by his crime, that he has a mother and a family and a past and hopefully a future. And that the kids in these stories are children. They're not metaphors. They are not cautionary tales, that you can't learn much about how to stop the next child being killed if you aren't very interested in why the last child was killed. And that to do that, you have to be open to their stories. You don't have to indulge their stories. You don't have to excuse their actions, but you need to want to know what happened. Wrapping up very quickly, I just want to talk a little bit about what I think, because I know there may be some journalists in here, what I think makes a good story. I think they need to be simple, not stupid, but simple. Tell the story about the thing that you're telling the story about. Don't tell 6 or 7 stories in one story. Tell one story well and properly, that you don't need necessarily big words or long sentences to tell a story. Make it easy on your reader. Lead them through the story. Make it straightforward. That it's much harder to write simply and clearly than it is, and short, than it is to write long and waffly and in a highfalutin way. This will seem obvious, but often in a reading I think it's not so obvious. Be as engaging as you can, that you are trying to get someone's attention here. And so that will involve mixing personal stories with context, and context with facts. And in that, you take people somewhere, that you make place and face and affect. You make them vivid so that someone feels that they are with you, and that you are taking them with you. Know your audience. If I was giving this talk to a group of primary school students, I would do it differently. If I was giving this talk to a group of Labour activists, I would do it differently. It wouldn't be less or more, but it would be different. And I would want to have some sense of who I was talking to. Assume maximum intelligence but minimum knowledge. That people will understand anything you tell them so long as you tell them, but you have to tell them. So don't assume that they know what you know. Find the tone to fit your tale. That there are stories that don't work with humor. There are stories that work well with humor. There are opportunities to inject all kinds of things into a story, but make sure that the things that you're injecting fit with the nature of the story that you're telling. Be in your story as much as you need to be and no more. That the presence of the writer can be intrusive. The cups of tea you drink, the trip that you make to the interview, well, who cares? And sometimes your absence can be confusing. That sometimes people need to know, well, how did you find that person? Or what, take me with you here. And that sometimes taking them with you means them really being with you. Be a reliable conduit for the information that you have. I studied to be an interpreter. And one of the things they would tell us about interpreting is it doesn't matter how well you're interpreting if people really don't believe that you know what you're talking about. And similarly, unless you're a trusted narrator, unless you can get the reader to trust you, then it doesn't really matter what you're saying. And finally, be yourself, because that's the one thing that nobody else can do for you. People often, when they write, try to adopt the voice of the writer. But the voice of the writer, so long as you're writing, is your voice. So use it. Thank you.